So the other theme of this morning was the academic ancestry of everyone being very tightly linked, and Matt illustrates that as well, because you heard this morning Chris supervised Tim, who supervised me. When I was on SCOMA, I was very closely supervised by Mike. Matt did his PhD in Sheffield, where he was supervised by myself and Tim, and he then subsequently moved to Oxford, where he worked with Chris, and is now currently the coordinator of the JNCC contract, which involves monitoring 6 species of seabird on SCOMA with Chris. And he's going to talk about a novel technique which he's going to be applying to facilitate that monitoring in his talk.
Thank you, Ben. It's either because it's such a great deal once you get into seabirds that you never leave, or there's some weird incestuous mafia type thing going on there. Moving on. So I'm going to talk today about a new technique that I was initially, I'll be perfectly honest, very sceptical about. Some friends of mine, some colleagues at work, were very interested in thermal imaging cameras to look at rhinoceroses on a field course in South Africa. I thought you could have done a lot more useful things with the technology and the money, particularly, but I have been forced to eat my words. So I'm going to be talking about how this thermal imaging can be applied to seabird ecology. I think it's got some really bright prospects, actually. We've heard some really important examples of why we should study seabirds if we're interested in understanding the long-term implications of changing climate, or if we're particularly concerned about how pollution events might affect these very important populations of seabirds. As an example of the PIB pollution on the south coast last winter before last. Or if you're interested in how fisheries stocks, how the extent of commercial fisheries might affect these long-term fluctuations in seabird populations. And the reason that seabirds are very useful is because they sit right at the top of a really kind of really deep food web. We don't often think of a puffin as an apex predator, but they're essentially the tigers of the ocean, gannets, guillemots, puffins. They're up there kind of as eating these forage fish that are way kind of up the food web there. And seabirds are useful because of that ecological position that they take, that trophic level that they occupy, and also to a certain extent it's easier to get that kind of long-term data on the long-term stability of the marine ecosystem than it is to try and study marine mammals, because they don't come to land and lay eggs particularly. I've never heard of that happening anyway. Definitely make the news. And fisheries data in particular can be hard to combine, partly because, as far as I understand it, a lot of fishermen own their own data and they're not particularly keen on sharing it unless it's going to make them some money or not get them into trouble. But if we're going to be interested in using seabirds as these long-term monitors, we've heard that these long-term studies are absolutely essential. As Tom Webb couldn't put it better, these long-term science time series are increasingly important, and they mustn't have any gaps in as well. But there's one certain limitation that a lot of the really high-quality long-term studies that people like Tim and Chris have been involved in over the years is that we're restricted at the moment to species that are more easily visible. If you can sit there with a telescope and see a bird laying an egg, or it's a lot easier if it's tucked away down a burrow, or if it is a more kind of inconspicuous burrow nesting species, it needs to be one that's tolerant of some degree of disturbance, like Manx shearwaters, which are pretty indestructible, if you like, within obvious bounds, to the amount of disturbance that they get from pesky field ornithologists. But that's not the case with an awful lot of seabird species. So are we missing out on some potentially useful ecological insights by not being able to study these particular species? And that's hopefully where this thermal imaging comes in. Because there are species like thermal imaging, there are species like storm petrels that I'll come on to in a second. Cut that. So, this piece of kit that my friend and our colleagues at work wanted to go and point at pregnant rhinoceroses, they could detect that a rhinoceros was pregnant compared to one that wasn't, so they were happy about it. Some set their standards not so high, but these things used to be stuck on the front of cruise missiles, essentially, to drop down chimneys of people that you wanted to generally mess up. And that sort of technology is fairly expensive, but now that there's not quite such an industry as there was in dropping bombs down chimneys, this stuff has become more marketised. And it's being put to very great use in the military context and search and rescue. So you can see a big white spot on the back of this ship here, and if you zoom in, you can see that that's a kind of very clear image of people who are things that are warmer than their background. The irony is that when these guys tried to take this to South Africa, it was classified as a weapon, and they weren't allowed to import it. Their loss was my gain, because that meant I got to play with it for the whole summer last year. There you go. Good old South African government, thank you very much. It cost me a lot of money to get them to do that. So what do you do with it? The first thing you do is point your thermal image camera and see what it can do, and point it at any trusty field assistant. It's the legendary David Boyle, many of you will know, long-term stalwart of the seabird studies with Chris Perrins and I over the last few years. And if you want to know where the hottest part of Dave Boyle is, then it's his face, of course, which is where you're focusing on. But you know, it's not just a pretty toy. You can get some useful quantitative data on which you can measure stuff. And you can see from the colour scale on the edge here that you can use it to kind of measure the temperature of something without touching it. So apart from making quite psychedelic images of Skookum Bird Observatory Lighthouse there, it's useful for picking out things that are much warmer than their surroundings. So rabbits, for example, in Skookum stand out really quite nicely. So as soon as you start to think about implications of these things, you realise that they are, you know, they're quite useful things that we can, if you're interested in warm-blooded species. So last year I took this out to Skookum and Skomer Islands to see if we could cast some light on this kind of the tricky ecology of storm petrels that Rob just talked about. And there are good reasons for doing that. There are long-term studies at the moment are relatively lacking. Rob talked about his long-term ringing weight database, if you like, but in the same context of having these long-term population studies that Ben talked about earlier, and Tim will talk about later on, and they're not really up there. And that's partly because they can be a bit sensitive to disturbance. People have made advances using nest boxes and simple things like not talking around storm petrels so they don't get upset by whatever accent it is that's talking to them. But generally speaking, they live in awkward places. They live in tiny little nooks and crannies in dangerous boulder screeds, places you don't really want to go. And the census work also is quite challenging as well. So when you try and get these population estimates, you know, it's quite tricky to know exactly how many of these things there are. They also occupy quite a different trophic level. They're not quite so high up the food chain, if you like. They're not quite such apex predators as other seabird species. So Rob hinted at that in their dependence on isopods and sort of discards and fragments of fish rather than on dolphins. And they're amber-listed. You know, they're of conservation concern. That's partly based on difficulties of knowing exactly what's happening in long-term population trends. But again, they're nesting on predator-free islands, which obviously expose them to a certain degree of risk if that biosecurity breaks down. So I put together a short video of a few things that we filmed last year on Skookum Island. So the first bit of footage is looking down a rocky slope into a storm petrel colony. And that was a real eye-opener. I won't repeat my language when I first switched this camera on and looked down at the colonies. I mean, I'm not by any means a long-term storm petrel pesterer, but you just look around at kind of the number of birds that are there. It was quite awe-inspiring, really. You can also use these cameras to help you locate nest sites. So this bird's flying around and you'll see it touches ground in a moment there. Just keep watching that little spot. And it's a vegetation-covered dry stone wall out on the northwest coast of Skookum. The bird's circling around and calling. You can't see it with the naked eye. If you turned your torch on, it would fly away. And out comes, presumably, its partner. So there you go. There's an occupied nest site. And if anyone who's spent a long time trying to mess around locating storm petrel nests, that's a big advantage. Another advantage is that we know of this technology is that we know very little about what goes on inside seabird burrows. So storm petrels are strictly monogamous. You have a maximum of 2 birds inside any nest burrow. Except there are 3 down this one, so whether that's some peculiar mating business going on that has been Tim's alternative lifestyle, alternative research focus of his career. That really was a slip. I've got my PhD now. But this, probably that other bird just got a bit freaked out and ducked down the nearest burrow that it could. So these things can tell you some interesting things inside burrows as well. This, I think, might be, we don't know much about storm petrel courtship behaviour, but the bird on the right is chicking, he's doing the kind of fairy vomit noise, and the bird on the left is also that kind of duetting in this chip call. And the one on the right-hand side's got a higher pitched chip than the one on the left. Is it a male? I don't know. The bird on the right was circling around and went into the burrow. And I've spared you all the kind of shaky crawling on the ground, being Ray Mears footage that went with it. But this perhaps is reminiscent of albatrosses, kind of or gannets waving their beaks in the air, displaying. It's not. I don't think it's feeding the other bird, but perhaps it's kind of, you know, indicating that perhaps it would do if it were invited to do so. So if you can get a clear view of what's going on inside the burrow, it can give you certainly an idea of whether it's occupied. There was no egg in there, it's kind of laid an egg. But it certainly gives you some interesting, you know, insights on the behaviour of these birds. And there he goes. And I'm about as far away as I am from Ben while I'm filming that, and there's no apparent effect on the bird's behaviour. There's another interesting thing you can do about trying to see. I was interested in this question of whether storm petrels really are very kind of sensitive to disturbance, and there's about 20 seconds of footage where the birds are swirling around doing their thing, and then after 20 seconds it's gone. Some of them are coming quite close to the camera, so they're literally brushing in front of your face while you're there filming. This is the sea up here. And then after 20 seconds or so, saying, coming up for now-ish, there, the light map turned a torch on. And they've all gone much further away from the camera. I left the torch on for about 30 seconds, just a standard headlamp. Some of them are kind of flying into shot and doing handbrake turns, if you use your imagination, flying away. And keep your eye up here, something comes to the party. There it goes. It's a short-eared owl. Just as I turn the torch off, in comes the bird. Now, I'm not suggesting that I'm kind of short-eared owl should not be allowed to catch storm petrels, but this does have some implication for whether the interaction of recreational visits to these kind of colonies and the potential unknown impact that they may be having. So we've been talking to the guys on the island, and they've seen how the birds come straight back when the torch goes off. And the wardens on the island are very keen on the idea of using red light filters to see whether that minimises this glare effect, because the last thing you want is, by studying these birds or showing off this kind of, you know, magnificent wildlife spectacle, is to kind of end up with some of them, you know, getting far more ring recoveries than you might like. Can you do anything useful with this rather than just pointing at things and saying, wow, well, I thought initially that these are two occupied storm petrel burrows here, where the yellow arrows are showing. And I filmed, this image is taken on quite a warm, sunny, it had been a warm, sunny day, so the whole dry stone wall is very warm. And I thought, well, you can't really pick out whether those particular nooks and crannies are any hotter than other places on the in that wall, until one of my students who was working on using this technique to look at swift nests in one of our dilapidated old campus buildings. And once he showed me how the software worked properly, I think you can identify that these areas are a little bit warmer than the surrounding areas. So, you know, there might be something in this. You can tinker about a little bit more with some of this software to have a look at these, the heat signatures. You see some rabbits in the background there that are kind of doing their thing in the middle of Skokie. And you can use these kind of post-processing techniques to pick out which are the warmer parts of a particular warning, perhaps, to be able to increase the number of known nest sites that are on Skokie Island. So it's quite possible that that might be worth some further work, which Rob and I are going to try out this summer. With Manx shearwaters, I think there's not much that thermal imaging can do necessarily that can't be done already, because I've mentioned earlier they're quite a robust species, but they are quite a spectacle if you have a look at just what these things look like. As you look up in the sky about just how many Manx shearwaters there really are. So that's the warden's quarters over North Haven, and it's quite early on in the night, and you can see that there are birds coming into land and kind of crashing down here onto some of the occupied, really dense burrow areas. But there's a really large number of birds flying around, perhaps non-breeders that are flying around. So I don't know whether this activity is going to vary an awful lot day to day with weather and so on, but perhaps there are ways in which there's some ways of employing this as perhaps to sort of measure relative abundance of these animals. But classically, seabirds might be all quite big shakes in the air or swimming around catching fish, but they're not up to much when they're hopping around the ground. But you notice it leaves a kind of nice warm bottom print behind it, so it's another way of detecting a Manx shearwater. And there's some really nice potential to increase the effectiveness of some population monitoring with other species. So Chris Perrins talked earlier on about how lesser blackback gulls, maybe not everyone's favourite charismatic species, they're really in quite a lot of trouble in Wales. They're in serious decline. And very low breeding success on Scoma and Skokun. They're in serious trouble. And Chris mentioned one of the census techniques is to try and monitor the number of occupied nests. It's very important to be able to get a handle on the productivity, the number of fledglings that each pair produces. Very tricky at the moment, because if you walk around counting the number of nests that you've got, what tends to happen is the gulls take a slight exception to this kind of thing, and it kind of affects your data by doing so. It's a classic kind of observer effect on this system. So what we're hoping to do is, Chris Taylor, who's used to be one of the wardens at Scoma Island, now we're working with WWT and Lancaster University on swans and power lines. We're going to try and see if we can use this thermal imaging to work out which pairs in a study plot, the number of breeding pairs that are around, because apparently at night they all just sit nice and tidily in pairs, and then it all kind of turns into a kind of fight in a youth club during the day. But hopefully that will give us a bit of an insight on the ecology of these animals as well. So I think it's a technique that's got a real sort of promise for refining our current methods in seabird ecology, and maybe opening some doors on some new species that are currently a little bit tricky to study. And perhaps when we combine this finding nests using thermal imaging or using infrared burrowscopes to look at some of these birds while they're inside nest burrows to find out how their breeding success is going, maybe we can bring this species into the fold as another one of these really important long-term studies. So I'm a relative newcomer, having migrated from a previous life in blue tits and grey tits recently. So I just thought I'd finish very briefly with thinking about why we should fund this kind of stuff. We were talking earlier on about how important it is that there might be species like kittiwakes that are starting to, the early signs of declines that we've seen in populations in Norway are starting to be detected in Wales. And that's why it's crucially important that this network of seabird monitoring programme sites coordinated by JNCC and funded by a whole range of different organisations, the PTO and ISPB, National Natural Resources Wales. These seabird colonies in Wales really are of pivotal importance because they're really acting as sentinels of relative calm, although kittiwakes are starting to go the wrong way. It's really important that we have these abundant, healthy seabird populations to be able to understand the fundamental ecology that's underlying these ecosystems. It's really important that they're studied and the monitoring continues. If you focus on the natural resources that these seabird populations indicate, there's ecosystem services like fisheries health, even perhaps underestimated factors like the fact that having healthy biodiversity is good for people's general well-being. Some good evidence that urban populations benefit from having this kind of access to nature. We're all kind of biased, I'm guessing. Nature makes us feel good, that's why we're here, that's why we're in these jobs, but these things are important on a society level. And someone mentioned tourism earlier on. If we don't look after these seabird populations, then the effect on the economy of Wales would also be quite drastic, and there are signs perhaps that that's already happened, and with the decline of some of the crashes of some seabird populations in Scotland. And to put the amount of money that's involved in these things into context, this is a figure of government spending in 2011 to 12. I haven't managed to find a more up-to-date one, but this is kind of work and pensions, this is the Department of Health, MOD, this is devolved spending for Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and DEFRA is the little tiny green speck up here, which coordinates, which is responsible for JNCC, the marine surveillance and monitoring budget that they coordinate, about £1 million overall if you include staff costs and so on. Apparently the amount of money that's actually spent on seabird monitoring is less than £60,000 a year. I think that's really cheap. I think that's great value for money, and it doesn't take into account the amount of work that a lot of people have done today to be able to tell the story behind a lot of these monitoring data. It's the analysis behind these long-term monitoring data that are crucial to be able to understand the value of these ecosystems. If it weren't enough that these things are just cool, it's very easy in my teaching to engage students with subjects like this, with deep apologies to anyone who's into isopods and wood lice and that kind of thing. You know, these things are important to humans, if you like. And of course, this is, I like to wrap up there, and it's, obviously I'm just getting going. Hopefully I'll be able to have some data to talk about one day rather than just pretty films. But already a lot of the work that I've done is obviously the result of a lot of help from lots of other people. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matt. Any questions?
Not so much a question as an observation. A couple of years ago I took an infrared video camera out to Scotland and filmed some shearwaters, young shearwaters, sitting outside the burrows. Bob took some photographs of those birds. Looking at the video afterwards, every time he took a picture, the bird flinched. Something that when you're taking pictures you don't see. But because I hadn't had it on video at the same time as it was happening, you could see that there was an effect.
Is it the shutter noise or
whether it was the noise or
flash,
flash, I don't know, but every picture the bird flinched. And after about 3, we moved on to another bird, and the same thing happened. I think that's about all we did.
Interesting. It's a thin shearwaters, but I think perhaps it's difficult for us to judge their response to. Birds don't really show their emotions as effectively as mammals, so it's difficult to tell.
How much do those cameras cost?
How much have you got? You can get one that will follow ballistic missiles for something like £250,000, but I think this one was a kind of a moderate spy figure sum. I can't remember, I think it was about £20,000. It's a lot for spotting a pregnant rhinoceros.
Top Rock will have to pay for that one. Okay, any more questions? No? Okay, thanks very much, Matt. Okay, so